Okay, so today we're going to talk about journalism and politics, and specifically we're going to look at uh, covering politics at the local level, the state level, the national level, and the importance of dedicating resources to that coverage, the importance of having journalists there as observers and monitors of power. Today we're going to talk about journalism and politics, and as has been the theme throughout this semester, we're going to tie it back into the primary purpose of journalism to provide citizens with the information they need to be free and self-governing. To start out with, let's look at the current state of journalists covering the Statehouse, that is where state government is conducted. From a report published by the Pew Research Center and American Journalism Review. Less than half of the journalists covering the Statehouse are now full-time reporters, and you can see the breakdown there is 35% newspaper reporters, 17% traditional, and 16% non-traditional. Wire services, radio, university news organizations, and additional sectors making up the rest of the coverage there. But from 2003 to 2014, you can see that the Statehouse coverage went from nearly 500 reporters to just around 300. That's a decrease of 35% in that time. Or to look at the specific numbers, that's 164 full-time Statehouse reporters that were cut from newspapers between the years 2003 2014. Again, a decline of 35%. And in their place, what we're seeing are for-profit or non-profit digital news organizations, ideological outlets, and perhaps higher-priced elite publications aimed at insiders popping up that are staffed by veteran reporters with experience covering state government. So they may have gotten their chops at newspapers and working as Statehouse reporters, but now they've moved on to other organizations where the driving purpose may or may not be providing citizens with the information they need to be free and self-governing. To look at a few other numbers here, less than a third of U.S. newspapers assign any kind of reporter to the Statehouse now. That's a significant change in coverage of government at the state level. 86% of local TV stations do not assign even one reporter to the Statehouse. 16% of the reporters in the Statehouses work for non-traditional outlets like digital-only sites and nonprofit organizations. And moreover, students account for 14% of the overall Statehouse reporting corps. So, what do these numbers mean? Why should we care? Well, we can see that news organizations of all kinds, and particularly newspapers, which had been the standard bearer in many ways for thorough, intensive coverage of politics for many years, that news organizations of all kinds are cutting back on their support and coverage of state houses. So state government is simply not being covered as thoroughly, as extensively, as broadly as it once was. And in the place of these traditional news organizations have come non-traditional organizations, which in some cases may be adhering to the journalistic principles that have been held by professional journalists for many years. Principles of objectivity and principles of investigative scrutiny and holding the powerful accountable and those sorts of ideals, but they also may not necessarily be adhering to or holding those standards up as their primary purpose. Indeed, with publications that are targeting more of an elite audience or an audience of inside baseball political pundits and players, obviously the intention of those publications is not to provide citizens with the information they need to be free and self-governing, but rather to attract an audience a target market of people that will pay for specific niche information, this insider baseball information. So there's a danger here that the press may be losing its power or position as a fourth estate in our society. Now, if you've heard this term before, you may already be familiar with it. But the term first came about, or is first known to have been popularized by the 19th century British historian Thomas Carlyle, who used it in reference to the press when he cited an 18th century Irish statesman, Edmund Burke, as the first to use the term in a debate in Parliament, referring to members of the press that were sitting in the galley then. And so in British tradition, there were four estates. The king, or some have debated perhaps the clergy, but the king, the lords, the commons. Of course, we know Parliament has the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So we had the king, or again perhaps the clergy in some people's understanding, the lords, the commons, and then the press. So you had four estates of society that together held one another accountable for the public business and the affairs of the government. Today, the press in our democratic society is somewhat loosely understood as a fourth branch of government. Of course, that's not entirely appropriate, since the press is technically outside of government and holds all members of governmental business accountable as an independent entity. But the tradition of the fourth estate comes again from this the British usage here, and in more modern society we've adopted the term to understand the press as sort of this independent observer to hold the governmental actors accountable. So you've heard me use this term or phrase, to hold the powerful accountable. And so journalists are to serve as monitors of power. Journalists have a credo, which is simply power corrupts. And so by default, if we assume that power corrupts or has the potential to corrupt, as those of you who've seen Lord of the Rings know, with Schmeagol sort of being the embodiment of corruption through the holding of power, that's sort of an image of the default position that journalists take when it comes to being monitors of power. Also, we've heard it said before that the role of journalists is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. That may be a little harsh, or maybe a little bit too activist for some people's liking. But the idea here is, again, that if we think of journalists as serving this role of ensuring social justice, or helping to promote social justice, then we want to try to deconstruct the status quo. We want to strive against the notion that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, or those with power gain more power, and those with power are prone to use it to their advantage and to the detriment of those without power. Thomas Jefferson simply said, "If I had to choose between a government without newspapers and newspapers without government, I wouldn't hesitate to choose the latter." So the Jeffersonian idea here is that really, again, to be a truly free, self-governing society, we need to have this free flow of information to where we can know what's going on, and that there is an institution in place, that there is a group of people in our society whose role is to try to make sure those with power don't abuse it. So in speaking of this notion that it's important for journalists to be able to hold the powerful accountable and to have a free press, the current presidential administration, Obama's White House, has prosecuted more whistleblowers for leaks and gone after more journalists than any of its predecessors. It's known to be the most hostile administration to the press than any other previous presidential administration. It has limited the photos that can be released to the press that are released by the White House, and what can actually be sanctioned and go out, or the access that photojournalists have to affairs of the presidential administration. It has called on only reporters selected ahead of time by senior aides in press conferences. And lest we think that this is just my own partisan dig at the Obama administration, here are some quotes from journalists themselves. Len Downey, the former executive editor of the Washington Post, described the Obama administration as, quote, the most aggressive since President Richard Nixon with respect to the press. NBC's Chuck Todd referred to the administration as, quote, very controlling. Joe Abramson, former New York Times executive editor, called it the most secretive administration. And New York Times reporter James Risen called it the greatest enemy of press freedom that we have encountered in at least a generation. But this idea of politicians being hostile to the press is a bipartisan phenomenon. You may remember the scandal of Governor Christie, who has been talked about as having presidential aspirations. But there was a scandal that came out that suggested that he had ordered or asked for lane closures on the George Washington Bridge in retaliation for a mayor who would not support his candidacy. And this story was broken by a local newspaper reporter, John Kachowski, of the Record, a daily newspaper in northern New Jersey. And his editor, Martin Gottlieb, pointed out how he got this story by having an ongoing, dedicated relationship with the people on his beat in Fort Lee. He said the people he called knew and trusted him, so they told him what was going on. It was only because Kachowski was a regular reporter that he had the sources that tipped him off about this lane closure that eventually made national news. David Carr, the late great media reporter for the New York Times, said it this way: before cable bobbleheads were debating Mr. Christie's future and bloggers were measuring the political impact of the scandal, there was a reporter and a simple question: why were these lanes closed? And so tying this all then back to the decline in reporters covering the Statehouse and an overall hostility of government officials toward the press, this is what is at stake. If we don't have reporters covering the local news on a regular basis, if we don't have reporters and journalists that are allowed access to the operations of our government and allowed to cover that fully, transparently for the public, then we risk losing out on these kinds of stories about politicians and those in power abusing their power. So I encourage you to think about, again, sort of how this role of journalists in monitoring power and serving as a watchdog really plays into your daily freedom and the decisions that you make about your life. What would you do if you found out that the governor of your state was perhaps implicated in an abuse of power? And in fairness, an internal investigation of Christie cleared him of any wrongdoing, and the Justice Department investigation has yet to be concluded and its findings announced. But again, the importance here is that the story needs to be told. The question needs to be raised: are our elected leaders, those in power, wielding it fairly and for the good of all of those they govern?